Adera grew up in a small, picturesque village nestled in the heart of Africa, where the sun painted the skies in vibrant hues at dusk, and the earth beneath her feet felt as if it held centuries of wisdom. She was known for her gentle spirit, but beneath that quiet exterior was a strength born from hardship and the lessons her late mother had instilled in her. Her mother had always told her, "Adera, no matter what life throws at you, stand tall. Strength lies not in the ease of your life, but in how you face its storms." Her mother's passing had left a hole in Adera's heart, but it also gave her a resolve that no one could break. She would honor her mother's teachings, no matter the challenges. Adera was determined to carve her own path, to rise above the circumstances of her birth, and perhaps one day become someone who could inspire others, especially women, to believe in their own power. However, when her father remarried Mama Kibi, everything changed. Mama Kibi was everything Adera's mother wasn't. She was calculating, cunning, and had an insatiable thirst for wealth. Her arrival into their home was like a storm tearing through a once peaceful land. Mama Kibi quickly began asserting control, turning Adera's life upside down with her cold demeanor and manipulative nature. It wasn't long before she started making decisions on behalf of the family, decisions that would affect Adera's future in ways she could never have imagined. Mama Kibi's plan for Adera was simple and sinister. She wanted to rid herself of her stepdaughter, and there was no better way to do that than by marrying Adera off to someone beneath her, someone with no wealth, no power, no influence. In Mama Kibi's eyes, a marriage to a poor farmer would be the perfect way to get rid of Adera and also claim the family's estate for herself. Omari was a quiet man, a farmer who lived on the edge of the village. He was hard-working, but his financial status made him an easy target for Mama Kibi's manipulative schemes. She saw him as the perfect match, someone who wouldn't threaten her control over the family's wealth, and someone who, she believed, could be easily discarded once he'd fulfilled his role. Adera was devastated when her father told her about the marriage arrangement. She had dreamed of something far greater than this: an education, independence, the chance to see the world beyond the confines of her village. She wanted to become a teacher, to give back to the children in her community and show them that there was more to life than simply surviving. But her dreams seemed to evaporate in the face of her father's indifference. He had remarried, and Mama Kibi's hold over him was unshakable. Her voice was drowned out by the pressure of family duty and expectations. Despite her heartbreaking, Adera knew she couldn't protest openly. Mama Kibi's cruelty was masked by false kindness, and her father's silence was a constant reminder that no one was going to support her. She was trapped, bound by the traditions and expectations that dictated her every move. Her father, once a loving figure in her life, had become a stranger who no longer listened to her, and the person she once looked up to for guidance had turned a blind eye to her pain. But Adera's spirit wasn't broken. The dreams her mother had instilled in her still flickered within her heart, and though it seemed impossible, she promised herself that she would find a way to rise above this. Even if she had to marry Omari, she would not let the world silence her voice. She would find a way to turn the page of this chapter, even if it meant starting a new story in the most unlikely of places. With tears in her eyes, Adera stepped into the life Mama Kibi had planned for her. But even as she entered the marriage that would bind her to Omari, she knew one thing for sure: she would never stop dreaming, and one day she would make her voice heard again. The day Adera was married felt like a blur, a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. The ceremony was small, rushed, as though everyone wanted it over with as quickly as possible. Her father, standing by Mama Kibi's side, had an air of indifference that cut deeper than any words ever could. It was as though he was no longer the man she once knew, but a mere shell of the person who had once loved her mother and cherished her. The guests, most of whom Adera had never seen before, watched in silence as she stood there, her heart heavy with grief and resentment. Her father had always been the one to protect her, to shield her from the world. But now he had given her away, without even a second thought, to a man she barely knew. Her father's eyes avoided hers throughout the ceremony, as if he couldn't bear to see the pain in her eyes. The heavy weight of betrayal settled in her chest as she said her vows. Her voice trembled, not because she was nervous, but because she could feel the sting of abandonment. She had imagined this day differently, a day of love, of choice, but it was nothing like the fairy tale she had always dreamed of. Instead, it was a grim reality, a decision made by others, one she had no say in. And then there was Omari. Omari, a quiet man with dark eyes that seemed to hold more sorrow than Adera could understand at the time. He was the kind of man who worked the land from dawn until dusk, a farmer whose name was known more for his poverty than for his good qualities. His modest hut on the outskirts of the village stood as a symbol of everything Adera had once feared: hardship, struggle, and a life that was far from the one she had dreamed of. When Adera first saw Omari, she didn't know what to think. He wasn't a cruel man, but neither was he someone she had chosen. His hands were rough from working the fields, his clothes simple and worn. He wasn't handsome in the way the village boys were, but there was something about his eyes, kind, yet distant, that made her pause. He wasn't the monster her stepmother had painted him to be, but neither was he the man she had hoped to spend her life with. The first few days in Omari's home were harder than Adera had imagined. The small hut felt suffocating, the walls closing in on her with every passing hour. The air was thick with the smell of dried maize and the sweat of a hard day's work. There was no space for the dreams she had carried with her, no room for the ambitions her mother had inspired in her. Instead, she found herself trapped in a life that was filled with mundane chores and endless labor. Omari, despite his kindness, had his own struggles. He worked tirelessly on the farm, tending to crops that barely seemed to yield enough to feed them both. Every day felt like a fight for survival, and Adera was thrust into that fight without warning, without preparation. Her hands, once soft from years of learning, now bore the marks of labor: scratches, bruises, calluses from working in the fields, helping Omari with the harvest. At first, Adera resented him. She couldn't understand why she had to marry him, why her life had to be reduced to this. He wasn't cruel, but his quiet demeanor felt like a barrier, something that kept her from connecting with him. She resented the life he had, the poverty that hung over their home like a dark cloud. His world was so different from hers, so far removed from the life she had imagined for herself. She had hoped for a life of learning, of adventure, not this. Omari, for his part, tried his best. He was patient with her, understanding when she struggled with the chores. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything of her. But there was something about the weight of his silence that made her feel more isolated than ever. They existed in the same space, but there was no connection, no spark. He was kind, but kind didn't change the fact that they were strangers bound by an arrangement neither of them had chosen. One evening, as they sat in the dim light of their hut, Omari spoke for the first time about his life. He told Adera about his struggles, how he had lost his parents in a flood when he was younger, how he had taken on the responsibility of caring for his younger siblings. He spoke of the dreams he once had: to own a better farm, to send his siblings to school, to escape the cycle of poverty. But those dreams had slipped away, one by one, as life had worn him down. Adera listened in silence. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who had been thrust upon her, but as someone with a story, someone who had suffered just as she had. She realized that Omari wasn't the cause of her pain. The pain came from the life they had been forced into together. But the realization didn't make it easier. It only made the struggle more complicated. The early days of their marriage were filled with quiet tension. Aderas' resistance remained strong. and though she tried to hide it, it seeped into her every action. She resented her father's decision, resented the life she had been given, and resented Omari for being the man who was supposed to fix everything. But she couldn't bring herself to voice her anger. She couldn't find the words to explain how trapped she felt, how her world had been turned upside down by a decision she had no control over. As the days turned into weeks, Adera's heart grew heavier. The hope that had once lived inside her seemed to be fading, replaced by a quiet resignation. This was her life now, and there was no escaping it. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a small part of her refused to give up. The strength her mother had instilled in her had not been erased. It simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. But for now, Adera faced the harsh reality of her new life. A life full of uncertainty, hardship, and a man she was still trying to understand. As the days passed, Adera began to notice the subtle ways Omari's patience and kindness broke down the walls she had built around her heart. At first, she had kept herself distant, hiding behind her anger and resentment. But Omari never pushed her, never demanded more than she was willing to give. His quiet presence was a stark contrast to the storm that raged inside her. Slowly, his actions began to speak louder than his words, and Adera found herself unable to ignore the small gestures of care he offered every day. It wasn't just the way he worked tirelessly in the fields, or how he made sure there was always food on the table, even when it was meager. It was in the little things, the way he checked on her in the mornings, how he would bring her a cup of warm water after a long day of work, or how he would insist on doing the hardest chores so that she could rest, even when he was exhausted. Omari never seemed to expect anything in return. He simply did what he could, as though it was second nature to him. And it was in these moments that Adera began to question the assumptions she had made about him. One afternoon, as she was tending to the small garden behind their hut, Adera saw Omari speaking quietly to a woman who had come to their home. At first, she didn't pay much attention, but as the conversation continued, she began to notice the woman's frail appearance and the way Omari gently supported her as they talked. The woman looked to be in her late 50s, her hair greying, her face lined with the marks of age and illness. Omari helped her into the hut, and Adera, curious, followed behind. Inside, Omari's mother lay on a small cot, her breathing laboured and shallow. The sight of her sick mother made Adera pause. She had never seen Omari this vulnerable before, this raw in his emotion. She watched as he carefully adjusted the pillows beneath his mother's head, making sure she was comfortable. He spoke softly to her in a language Adera didn't understand, his voice filled with both tenderness and sadness. It was then that Adera began to realize that Omari's life was much more complicated than she had thought. He wasn't just a poor farmer trying to make ends meet. He was a son and a brother, carrying the weight of his family on his shoulders. Omari's parents had died in a flood when he was just a teenager, leaving him to care for his younger siblings. He had taken on the responsibility of raising them, providing for them in every way he could, even though the burden was often too much to bear. Adera learned that Omari had worked multiple jobs over the years, and yet he had never been able to save enough money to secure a better life for himself or his family. His dreams of owning a larger farm or sending his siblings to school had been buried under the weight of their survival. The revelation left Adera speechless. She had never considered the struggles Omari had endured, the sacrifices he had made. All she had seen was a man who was poor, a man who seemed to live in a world that she didn't want to be a part of. But now she began to see the strength in him, the resilience that had kept him going despite the hardships. She could no longer deny that Omari's heart was as rich as any man's, perhaps richer, in a way that mattered more than any gold or land could. It was during a particularly hard week when Adera fell ill. It started with a sharp pain in her chest, then a fever that made her head spin. She tried to continue with her chores, not wanting to burden Omari, but by the third day, she could barely move. The heat of the fever made her weak, and the cold sweat that clung to her skin only made her more miserable. Omari, who had been out in the fields, found her lying on the bed, shivering, her face pale and flushed. He didn't panic, didn't yell at her for overworking herself. Instead, he knelt beside her and gently stroked her forehead, his hand cool against her fevered skin. "You need rest," he said softly, his voice full of concern. Adera felt a rush of embarrassment. She had always prided herself on being strong, on carrying her own weight, but now she was helpless, and Omari was there, looking after her as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He made her drink a mixture of herbs, something his mother had taught him to prepare when he was young. The bitterness of the liquid made her gag, but she drank it anyway, trusting him, even though she hadn't realized when that trust had begun to grow. Omari stayed with her through the night, bringing her water, checking her temperature, and making sure she was comfortable. It was the first time she truly felt cared for, and it unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. By the time the fever broke, Adera found herself with a newfound sense of gratitude for Omari. The walls she had built around her heart were crumbling, piece by piece, as she saw more of the man beneath the surface. Omari wasn't just the poor farmer who had been forced into her life. He was someone who had given up everything to take care of his family, someone who had put others before himself. He was a man of integrity, of quiet strength, and slowly, Adera began to respect him, not just as her husband, but as a person. With this newfound respect came an understanding that changed everything. Adera began to realize that wealth wasn't the only measure of a person's worth. She had spent so much of her life thinking that money, status, and education were the keys to a meaningful existence. But Omari had shown her that there was more to life than that. There was strength in kindness, in selflessness, in the ability to keep going even when the odds were against you. As she recovered, Adera's perspective began to shift. She started to help Omari with the farm and the household chores, no longer seeing it as a burden, but as a way to contribute to their shared life. The simple act of working together in the fields, side by side, forged a bond between them that neither of them had anticipated. Omari's quiet presence became a source of comfort for her, and she realized that their marriage, though forced, had the potential to become something much more meaningful. She had come to understand the depth of Omari's character, and in doing so, she had begun to change herself as well. Together, they were building something stronger than either of them had imagined, one small, imperfect step at a time. As time passed, Adera began to realize that her circumstances, though challenging, didn't define her. She had always believed in the power of hard work and education, and though her dreams of attending school had been dashed, she still had the knowledge and resourcefulness her late mother had instilled in her. It wasn't long before Adera put that knowledge to work. She had watched her mother care for their land with skill and patience, using methods that had been passed down through generations. Adera had always been fascinated by her mother's approach to farming, the way she could coax life from the soil with minimal resources. Now, with Omari's help, Adera decided to apply some of those techniques to their small farm, hoping that a change in their approach could make a difference. Together, they began by planting more diverse crops, experimenting with new methods of irrigation that would help conserve water. Adera had learned from her mother how to work with nature, not against it, and she brought those principles to the land. She also taught Omari how to properly rotate crops to prevent soil depletion, and how to use organic fertilizers instead of the chemical alternatives that were often too expensive. Their efforts, though slow at first, began to pay off. The land, once dry and unyielding, began to show signs of life. As the months passed, the farm flourished. The fields, once sparse and neglected, now teemed with fresh produce. They grew vegetables, beans, and grains that were not only sustaining them, but were becoming a source of income as well. Adera's sharp mind and creative solutions were proving invaluable, and the fruits of their labor began to transform their lives. Seeing the success of their farm gave Adera a sense of pride, but she wasn't content to stop there. She realized that, in addition to their farm, there were other ways she could contribute to their community. Adera had always been talented at making handcrafted goods, from woven baskets to cloth, and she began to sell these at the local market. It was something small at first, just a way to supplement their income, but as she gained confidence, Adera started experimenting with different products, learning what sold best and how to reach more customers. Her small business grew, attracting attention from other women in the village who were impressed by Adera's initiative and the way she balanced both the farm and her entrepreneurial ventures. They admired her intelligence, her resilience, and her ability to make the best of her situation. It wasn't long before Adera became a source of inspiration for other women, many of whom had never considered the possibility of independence outside of their traditional roles. She began to encourage them to use their skills, to find ways to support themselves, and to pursue their dreams, just as she had done. One by one, the women began to step out of their own limitations, inspired by Adera's example. Some started their own small businesses, while others took a more active role in their families' farming operations. The village began to change, slowly but surely, as more women took ownership of their lives, supported by Adera's encouragement and wisdom. Her once quiet and humble presence became a beacon of hope for many, and soon the villagers began to look at Adera not just as a wife, but as a leader and a role model. The changes in Adera's life didn't just affect her community, they affected her relationship with Omari as well. As their farm began to thrive and their lives improved, Adera and Omari's bond deepened. What had begun as a forced union, built on duty and obligation, had evolved into something much more profound. Omari admired Adera's strength, her intellect, and the way she carried herself with grace despite the challenges they had faced. He saw in her not only a wife, but a partner, someone who was working alongside him to build a better life for their family. Adera, too, had come to see Omari in a new light. Where once she had only seen his poverty, now she saw the man behind the struggles, a man who had always done his best, who had cared for his family with unwavering devotion. Her respect for him had grown in ways she never expected. As they worked side by side in the fields, as they managed their small business together, their partnership became something that neither could have imagined when they first met. Their relationship was no longer defined by the bitterness of forced marriage, but by the genuine love and respect they had for each other. They spent their days working toward common goals, supporting one another through challenges, and celebrating their successes together. Adera no longer saw Omari as a poor farmer. She saw him as a man of integrity, of strength, and of deep compassion. And Omari, in turn, saw Adera not just as a wife, but as a partner in every sense of the word, a woman who had proven herself capable of shaping her own destiny, no matter the obstacles. As their farm flourished, their reputation in the village grew. They were no longer the couple that people whispered about, the ones forced into marriage by circumstances beyond their control. They had become a symbol of what could be achieved through hard work, love, and mutual respect. Adera's influence began to spread beyond the village as well, as people from nearby towns sought her advice on how to improve their own lives. She had become a woman of wisdom and influence, someone whose story was an inspiration to all who heard it. Through all of this, Omari and Adera's bond only grew stronger. They celebrated their successes together and supported each other through their struggles. And though their marriage had begun as something forced and painful, it had transformed into something beautiful, a union built on love, trust, and partnership. The two had gone from strangers to best friends, from reluctant partners to soulmates. Together, they had built a life that neither of them could have imagined when they first met. The changes in their lives were not just material, they were emotional, spiritual, and personal. Adera had found her voice, her independence, and her worth, and in doing so, had transformed the life of the man she had once resented. And Omari, through Aderas' example, had come to understand that wealth was not the measure of a person's worth. What mattered most was the strength of character, the ability to rise above adversity, and the love that could flourish even in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their journey was one of growth, transformation, and love. A journey that had begun with hardship, but had ultimately led to a life they could both be proud of. Together, they had built something far more valuable than wealth. They had built a future filled with love, respect, and hope. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the village as Adera went about her evening chores. Omari had just returned from the fields, his hands calloused, but his spirit lifted by the prosperity they had built together. Their small farm, once struggling, now flourished under their careful stewardship. Adera felt a quiet sense of pride as she watched the golden fields sway in the breeze, their hard work paying off day by day. It was in this moment of peace that Adera received word that Mama Kibi was coming to visit. Her heart sank at the mere mention of her stepmother's name. Mama Kibi, with her sharp tongue and cruel intentions, had never cared for Adera, nor had she ever truly embraced her as part of the family. Adera knew the woman well, and though she had tried to put the past behind her, there was no denying the unease that now settled in her chest. The idea of Mama Kibi returning, especially with everything Adera had achieved, filled her with dread. News of Adera's success had travelled through the village, and it didn't take long for Mama Kibi to hear of it. The woman had never been one to miss an opportunity, especially one that could benefit her. She arrived in the village a few days later, her expensive clothes and well-maintained appearance standing in stark contrast to the humble surroundings of Adera's home. Adera greeted her with a sense of polite detachment, her heart beating faster with each passing moment. She watched as Mama Kibi sauntered into their modest home, her eyes taking in the sight of their flourishing farm and the humble beauty of the home that Adera and Omari had built together. "Oh, how things have changed," Mama Kibi remarked, her tone oozing with false sweetness. "This place looks almost respectable now, Adera. I must admit, I never thought you would manage it." Adera's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. She knew better than to fall for the sweet words veiled in venom. Mama Kibi had always been manipulative, and Adera suspected that this visit had little to do with genuine interest in her well-being. "I'm glad you've noticed, Mama Kibi," Adera replied evenly. "We've worked hard for what we have." Mama Kibi smiled slyly, her eyes gleaming with something Adera couldn't quite place. "Well, you're certainly doing well for yourselves. But of course, I'm sure you wouldn't mind sharing a little of that good fortune with your family. After all, what is a family for if not to support one another?" Adera felt her stomach turn. She had seen this coming. The old woman was here to exploit her, just as she had done when she married Adera off to Omari. Adera had worked hard to build this life, and she wouldn't let her stepmother take advantage of it. "I'm sorry, Mama Kibi," Adera said firmly, her voice unwavering, "but I can't give you anything. We've worked hard for everything we have, and we intend to keep it." Mama Kibi's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She quickly regained her composure, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand, Adera," she said, her voice growing cold. "You've grown comfortable in your little world, haven't you? But remember, your father and I gave you everything. And now, when you have the means to help, you turn your back on your own flesh and blood." Adera's pulse quickened, but she stood tall, refusing to let the old woman manipulate her. She knew that Mama Kibi's kindness was nothing more than a mask, a means of getting what she wanted. There would be no more cowering to her stepmother's demands. "I'm not turning my back on anyone," Adera said, her voice strong. "But you've never cared about me or anyone else in this family. You only care about what you can take." Mama Kibi's face twisted with fury, but Adera held her ground. The air between them crackled with tension as the weight of their past hung heavy in the room. Adera thought back to the many times her stepmother had tried to tear her down, to break her spirit. She remembered the harsh words, the emotional manipulation, and the way Mama Kibi had tried to force her into a marriage that had seemed like a prison. But Adera had survived. She had fought through the years of hardship and emerged stronger than before. And she wasn't going to let Mama Kibi tear her down now. As if a switch had been flipped, Adera felt the memory of her late mother's voice fill her mind. Her mother, the woman who had always taught her to stand tall and fight for what was right. The woman who had never allowed anyone to walk over her. Adera closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath, grounding herself in the wisdom her mother had passed down. "Mama Kibi," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I don't need your approval, and I don't need your manipulation. I've learned how to stand on my own 2 feet, and I won't allow you to take that away from me." Mama Kibi's eyes flashed with anger, but Adera didn't flinch. The stepmother's power over her had been broken long ago, and now she was merely a shadow of the woman she once was. Mama Kibi stood up, her face reddened with humiliation. She had come expecting to dominate Adera, to use her newfound success as a means to further her own selfish desires. But Adera had refused to bend, and for the first time, Mama Kibi saw that she no longer had any control over the young woman. "You may have won this time, Adera," Mama Kibi hissed, her voice laced with venom. "But remember this. I have a way of getting what I want. Don't think this is over." But Adera stood tall, unwavering. "It is over, Mama Kibi. You have no power over me anymore." With that, Mama Kibi stormed out of the house, her plans thwarted. As she left, Adera felt a sense of triumph wash over her. The woman who had once tried to destroy her was now powerless, and Adera had won. In that moment, Adera knew that she had not only defeated Mama Kibi, but had also conquered the fears and insecurities that had once held her back. She was no longer a girl at the mercy of her stepmother's cruelty. She was a woman who had forged her own path, and nothing, not even Mama Kibi, could take that away from her. As the seasons passed, Adera and Omari's hard work began to bear fruit in ways they had never imagined. The farm, once a symbol of struggle, had transformed into one of the most prosperous in the region. The crops flourished under Adera's innovative techniques, and the small business she had started at the market grew steadily, earning her a reputation as a resourceful and capable woman. Omari's strength and diligence, combined with Adera's intelligence and entrepreneurial spirit, had turned their humble home into a symbol of hope for others in the village. The villagers, who had once looked at them with skepticism and pity, now viewed them with admiration. Whispers of Adera's success spread like wildfire, and soon it wasn't just the crops and business that gained attention. It was the transformation in her. Adera had become a beacon of strength, an example of resilience, and a woman who defied the expectations placed upon her. She had taken her forced marriage, the hardship and the manipulation, and turned it into something beautiful, a life of empowerment and love. One evening, as the golden light of the setting sun bathed their farm in a warm glow, a group of villagers gathered in front of their home. They were carrying a beautiful crown made of woven grasses and adorned with colourful beads, flowers, and symbols of prosperity. Adera stood at the doorstep, her eyes wide in surprise as the villagers approached, their faces beaming with pride. "Adera," the village elder, an old woman named Mirembe, began, her voice carrying the weight of respect and reverence. "You have shown us what true strength is. You have led with kindness, with wisdom, and with love. And for that, we crown you the queen of our hearts." Adera felt her breath catch in her throat as the crowd cheered. She had never expected this, never imagined that one day she would be celebrated in this way. But as the crown was placed on her head, she realized that it wasn't the title or the recognition that mattered. It was the journey, the growth, and the love she had found along the way. The crown was a symbol of all that she had overcome, all that she had built with Omari by her side. Tears welled up in Aderas' eyes as she looked out at the faces of the villagers, the same people who had once judged her, who had once pitied her. Now they saw her as a leader, as a woman who had turned her life around and inspired others to do the same. "I am not a queen," Adera said softly, her voice carrying the weight of humility. "I am just a woman who believed in love, in hard work, and in the power of resilience. And it is because of the people around me, especially Omari, that I am here today." Omari stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his expression filled with pride and admiration. Together, they had created something beautiful, something far beyond material wealth. They had created a life built on mutual respect, partnership, and love. As the villagers celebrated, Adera reflected on the path that had brought her here. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had been forced into a marriage with a man she had never known, a life she had never chosen. Her stepmother, Mama Kibi, had tried to break her spirit, to make her feel small and powerless. But Adera had refused to give up. She had fought, not just for herself, but for the life she had always dreamed of, a life where she could love, grow, and make a difference. She thought of her late mother, the woman who had instilled in her the strength to face adversity and the belief that every challenge could be overcome. Adera had carried her mother's wisdom with her every step of the way, and it had guided her through the darkest moments. Now, as she stood in front of the villagers, wearing the crown that symbolized her triumph, Adera knew that her journey was far from over. There was still much to do. She and Omari had big plans to use their success to help others, to lift up the women in their community, and to ensure that no one else had to face the struggles that Adera had. "We will help those in need," Adera said, her voice filled with determination. "We will use what we have to give others a chance to rise, just as we have. We will show the world that anything is possible with love, hard work, and a belief in oneself." The crowd erupted into applause, and Adera felt her heart swell with pride. This was her moment, her victory, not just over her circumstances, but over the forces that had tried to keep her down. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world, and with Omari by her side, she knew that together they could accomplish anything. As the evening wore on and the village celebration continued, Adera felt a deep sense of peace. She had gone from a life of forced decisions to one of empowerment, from a girl who had been manipulated to a woman who had found her own way. And she had done it all with love in her heart and the unwavering belief that her worth wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. With Omari beside her, Adera knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, but they were no longer the scared, uncertain couple they had once been. They were partners, equals, and together they would continue to build a life that was as strong, as beautiful, and as resilient as the love they shared. And so, with the crown of their hearts upon her head, Adera looked to the future with hope. The woman who had once been forced into a marriage of obligation was now the queen of a love that had transformed her life. And she would continue to reign, not with fear, but with the strength of her spirit and the unwavering support of those who loved her.